Hello, and thank you for your interest in the municipal naming project. This video presentation will provide you with a high-level summary of community engagement results and the draft naming policy that was developed based on Canada-wide best practices and precedent and made entirely unique for the City of St. Albert based on resident participation and feedback. So let's begin. To recap, the inception of this project goes back to June 2021 after the city received numerous requests from the public to remove the Grandin name from municipal assets. The City of St. Albert's Council believed that a revised naming policy project would enable the municipality to address current and future naming issues that may arise. And across Canada, many municipalities have developed name removal and renaming processes, as well as modernizing their naming policies to be more reflective of today's values. And I'd like to touch base on the council motions that have led us here today. The first was a motion to propose a business case to undertake revisions to the municipal naming policy. That would also include consideration of the Pehonen report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Diversity and Inclusion Declaration. And also this motion where council approved the budget to undertake significant public engagement and recommendations regarding possible renaming of municipal properties associated with those involved in the residential school system. And lastly, this motion for administration to provide council with an updated draft policy in December 2022 and to conduct comprehensive stakeholder and public engagement to gather community input. Here we will summarize the project timeline and milestones. So to begin, from June till August, an environmental scan of naming and renaming work across Canada was conducted. This research enabled our team to understand current and emerging best practices. In August, we began connecting with subject matter experts who had been involved in naming and renaming projects to learn how they had approached this work and how the City of St. Albert could optimize results for this initiative. On August 16th, the project team introduced the project to council and provided an overview of how engagement would inform the policy. In September, we held 4 virtual information sessions for residents to learn more about the project and to address questions and concerns. We also held 2 separate sessions for Grandin residents to provide additional information about the logistics and potential costs of a name change should one occur in the future. In October, we held our first focus group meeting where we began discussing criteria for naming and name removal, including concepts of community values and dishonor. On November 1st, we had our panelist event with 5 leaders in naming work to guide our team and the audience through the various reasons a name change occurs and how municipalities can effectively implement a modern naming policy. Following this event, our team held 4 workshops with both Catholic schools and public schools in the city to learn how the next generation perceives community values. The youth workshops were very important because it is more so this generation that will be impacted by place names and also for a longer period of time. We then had our second focus group session where we refined some concepts of name removal and naming criteria and process. Following this, our team completed their first draft of the naming policy and submitted it to city administration for review and feedback. Lastly, on November 30th, we held our final focus group meeting where we reviewed the draft policy and received additional feedback. From September until the end of November, we hosted a project survey for those who participated in engagement events. And they were provided the opportunity to provide their feedback and their ideas on the naming policy criteria and processes. So these results will be shared in this presentation and in greater detail in the What We Heard report that will be available in early 2023. Multiple invitations to participate in the project were extended to several Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations at various intervals throughout the project. They were also invited to participate in our focus groups and provided feedback on various aspects of the draft naming policy. The project survey and other opportunities for feedback were also shared, and our team worked collaboratively with Indigenous community partners throughout the duration of the project. While we have reviewed the findings of the environmental scan with the public during previous engagement events, we wanted to provide a brief recap. For the scan, 76 instances of name removal and or renaming was researched. It was discovered that 71 of the 76 instances resulted in a removal or a renaming, and in 5 instances, the name was retained due to excessive cost, or the municipality proceeded with an alternative solution. So before we get into everything, let's review how engagement functioned to influence the draft naming policy. We asked residents to define community values, and these values in turn translated into criteria for municipal naming. We asked who should be consulted in naming processes, and these responses informed the future process for stakeholder engagement. We asked what we should be naming municipal assets after, and this defined our themes for future naming. We also asked how we should be defining dishonor, and this led to the supportive criteria and process for name removal and renaming an asset. So the results of the survey go like this. 75% of respondents believed that St. Albert's naming practices should be a reflection of community values. 65% believed that naming practices should uphold and reflect the city's diversity and inclusion declaration. 60% believe naming practices should reflect the city's pledge for reconciliation. And 65% believe the city should replace names determined to have a dishonorable association. We asked if the city should cease to use commemorative names in order to avoid future renaming. The results for this question were mostly split, so the draft policy does allow for continued commemorative naming. However, the criteria has been amended to address public concerns and to be in alignment with many other municipalities in Canada. We asked who should be able to initiate a review of a name removal, and the results were also fairly split. So in the draft policy now, anyone may initiate a name removal request. However, there are criteria that must be met and processes that must be observed. We asked how name change requests should be evaluated. And once again, the community is rather split. In the draft policy, name removal requests will now be scored against standardized criteria and must have demonstrated community support for the removal. And we'll get to that shortly. Our team set up sounding boards throughout the city at various intervals in the project. The results of defining dishonor include racism, oppression, bigotry, systemic racism, cultural genocide, and champion residential schools, among other responses. We also asked what residents believed St. Albert's community values were, and there was an emphasis on culture, inclusivity, nature, history, and traditions. We also asked for ideas and themes for future naming that the city may consider going forward. The results of all the sounding boards will be available in the What We Heard report. So why did we have focus groups for this project? Well, frankly, a naming policy is a very important guiding document for a municipality, and to only use feedback from the public would have led to an incomplete engagement process. The focus group represented a wide cross-section of residents from all walks of life in the city. This enabled us to hear diverse perspectives from diverse people with diverse interests in the outcome of the policy. The focus groups provided our team with a wealth of qualitative feedback that translated seamlessly into policy criteria and processes. And most importantly, we were able to hear from residents in a small group setting about their immediate and long-term interest in the naming policy and learned how the policy might impact them. The focus group was intended to be reflective of St. Albert's diversity of residents. And so we invited residents from a range of community groups. We had 3 Grandin residents participate, several members of local Indigenous communities and the Métis local, the United Church, the public and Catholic and Francophone school boards, a wide range of community organizations and groups, representatives from the LGBTQIA2S+ community, youth advocacy representatives, arts and heritage, and many others. Our first focus group helped our team identify community values that would help shape the criteria for naming going forward. We also explored concepts of dishonor, and this led to criteria for name removal, but also provides criteria for ensuring no new commemorative names are associated with dishonorable criteria. And we explored themes and ideas about how the city may name assets going forward. In our second focus group, we reviewed all the naming criteria data that had been collected so far and asked the group if anything was missing or if anything should be prioritized. This is where participants agreed that a prioritization of Indigenous belonging and history should be evident in the naming policy, and that the city needs to be more inclusive of diverse languages and to provide proper pronunciation tools for residents to learn words that aren't in English. We refined our name removal criteria and developed key steps in the name removal process based on this feedback. We will get into this in greater detail soon. We also explored what a community engagement process for renaming might look like, and we cover this in our review of the draft policy as well. Our first youth workshop was at Belrose School with grades 10 through 12 students. We asked students what they loved about St. Albert, how they defined St. Albert's community values, talked about what diversity and inclusion meant to them, and how the city should name municipal assets going forward. The information from the first 3 questions was used to create a piece of art as a thank you to the school, and all the data collected was used to inform the naming policy. This is Belrose's piece of art. This style is called graphic recording, and now the students and the schools who participated may be reminded of the valuable ways they contributed to the city's new naming policy. The second school we went to was Hillgrove School, and we met with grade 7 students. This school was particularly interesting for us as the school had recently undergone a name change with the combination of 2 schools into one, and is now named Hillgrove. Students here had a particular interest in culture, Indigenous inclusion, and St. Albert's setting in nature. And this is Hillgrove's art based on that feedback. We went to Holy Family Catholic School and had a workshop with grade 4 and 5 students. The students here cared deeply about their relationship with God, their relationships with one another, respect, equality, and doing what is right. Having recently had a renaming of their own school, many students understood what this meant, and when asked how the city should name assets going forward, many participants said, "Name after good people, not bad people." And this is Holy Family's artwork. And lastly, we went to Albert Lacombe School and met with grade 5 students here. Many students expressed their passion for sports, friends and family, feelings of safety, and treating others with kindness. The youth at this school also had an interest in flora and fauna and using different languages and naming. When one of our facilitators asked the group, "What should we do if we don't know how to pronounce a word that isn't in English?" And a child called out, "Learn how." In fact, at every school, in every breakout group, youth emphasized the importance of using languages other than English in place naming. This is Albert Lacombe's school's artwork. The youth workshops were tremendously helpful for our team to understand how the next generation perceives their community and what they value about each other and their greater community. The next generation will arguably be the most impacted by the new naming policy and will be impacted for longer. It was very important to hear from the youth about their visions for commemorative naming and place naming, and all 4 schools demonstrated exceptional leadership and innovation in the workshops. So now we're going to bring it all together and go over the draft policy and how it came to be. The development of the policy was to be guided by 3 main elements. The process was initiated by the council directives. The policy required extensive revisions. The policy required public engagement to determine how the community defined the values that would direct the policy. And the policy needed to be in alignment with the Pehonen report and the TRC calls to action, as well as the city's diversity and inclusion declaration. As we just covered, all the engagement feedback collected was derived from 6 information sessions, 3 focus group sessions, Indigenous engagement, an online survey, one-on-one conversations, the art and theater event on November 1st, 4 youth workshops, and the feedback received through the Cultivate the Conversation website, as well as the sounding boards. Finally, we had the results of the environmental scan where similar naming and renaming projects have occurred. We reviewed multiple naming policies across Canada to learn from their best practices, and we had countless conversations with subject matter experts and community leaders in naming and renaming work. All of these elements resulted in tangible results that define values of the community, actions that are considered dishonorable, and recommendations for process on how to name and rename assets. Most importantly, these results have been truly defined by the St. Albert community. All of these results feed into the main sections of the naming policy. General naming principles are more generic and help set the stage for the remainder of the policy. Most evident throughout the engagement and precedent review was the need to establish a criteria and process for naming. When we think of values, it defines of what we should be naming after. And when we think of dishonor, it defines what we should not be naming after. In addition to this, commemorative naming needed more structure and guidelines to ensure that the people we name after meet the values of the community. After the criteria is established, a process for how to name assets is needed. Next is setting a criteria on how a name shall be removed and what constitutes the need to remove a name. Similar to naming, a process to remove a name based on this newly established criteria is needed. Finally, once a name is removed or there is a desire to rename an asset, we needed to establish a criteria and process for renaming. Before we get into some of those finer details, a policy statement has been established to ensure that all users understand the overall intention and purpose of the policy. The statement reads, names of municipal assets in the city of St. Albert are to reflect the city's diverse residents, histories, cultures, languages, and values. The naming or renaming of a municipal asset should be an equitable, inclusive, transparent, and comprehensive process, and should reflect city goals and policies to establish a welcoming, diverse, and inclusive community. This policy is intended to enable all residents of the city with opportunity to have their histories, cultures, languages, and values reflected in names throughout the city. This policy is intended to provide a framework for naming, name removal, and renaming that reflects modern day values while allowing the capacity to adapt to continually evolving values in the city of St. Albert. When we think of general naming principles, we're considering some of the general themes that are guiding the policy. Many of these are usually administrative, but they needed to be expanded to integrate feedback and what best practices are for the rest of the policy. So names can be submitted by any member of the public. Names must follow the naming criteria established in the policy. Names and themes may be in any language with priority given to Indigenous languages. Perceived difficulty to pronounce a name is not a reason to exclude a name from consideration, and pronunciation tools will be developed with language carriers to ensure proper pronunciation is learned. Commemorative names must be in accordance with the naming criteria. Names can be recommended for removal by any member of the public. The new naming criteria includes the following: local geography or topographical features, flora, fauna, and other natural features, traditional usage, ways of knowing, cultural and historic interpretive elements of local and regional Indigenous people, a historic event significant to local Indigenous communities, the city, province, or nation, generic words that represent the historical, cultural, ethnic, language, or gender diversity of the community, a commemorative name provided that it is in alignment with the remainder of the naming criteria, generic names that support an approved theme or existing naming structure. Significant revisions were undertaken for the criteria for commemorative naming. This criteria is in alignment with public feedback and also in alignment with other municipalities with modern naming policies. New commemorative names must meet at least two of the following criteria: belonging to an equity deserving group that is traditionally underrepresented in commemorative naming practices, demonstrates excellence, courage, or exceptional dedication to service in ways that bring special credit to the city, province, or nation, volunteers that give extraordinary help or care to individuals, families, service clubs, cultural groups, ethnic organizations, community organizations, or supports community services or humanitarian causes, fosters equality and reduces discrimination, risks their own life to save or protect others, achieves a deed or activity performed in an outstanding professional manner or at an uncommonly high standard, has made an exceptional contribution of service in areas that have benefited the community, historical significance that contributed to the growth and ongoing establishment of the city of St. Albert. Naming criteria also now defines what the city shall not use for naming. Names shall not be or be perceived to be discriminatory or derogatory of race, color, ethnic origin, gender identity or expression, sex, sexual orientation, creed, political affiliation, disability, or other social factors. Represent an individual person, group, symbol, practices, or event that is connected with a negative, tragic, or harmful experience and or the oppression of a group of people. Results in inappropriate abbreviations or acronyms. Duplicates another named asset. Unduly detracts from the character, integrity of the community or aesthetic quality of the property, or unreasonable interference with its enjoyment or use. Naming process. The draft policy also has a process for how residents may submit a name for the names reserved list, formerly known as the significant names list. Applications may be made by any member of the public, and the application may be for a generic name or a commemorative name. A commemorative naming recommendation has to meet the criteria we previously outlined, and a name or word in any language other than English should also be provided with a pronunciation guide. Also, words or names in Indigenous languages should be supported by proper engagement and protocol where appropriate. One of the greatest tasks of this project was to define name removal criteria that is consistent with best practices across Canada and also a reflection of the community's feedback. A name may now be considered for removal where the name meets one of the following criteria. Refers to current or historic persons known for their discriminatory views and actions, including committing or perpetuating acts of racism, violence, and or harm against Indigenous people and or equity-deserving groups. Includes derogatory terms that might represent or be linked with discriminatory views and actions. Negatively represents or appropriates the culture of Indigenous peoples and or equity-deserving groups. Is inconsistent with city's membership with the Coalition for Inclusive Municipalities and the city's Diversity and Inclusion Declaration. Brings the city of St. Albert into disrepute with the general public, Indigenous peoples, and or equity-deserving groups. People who have been credibly accused or convicted of violent or serious crimes. Another section of the draft naming policy that is entirely new is the name removal process. A name removal application may be made by any member of the public, including city administration and council. A name removal application must be completed, providing rationale for reviewing the name, precedent of identical name removals elsewhere if possible, and most notably, documented support for the name removal from the community. And this may look like petition signatures and letters of support from a minimum of 20 members of the public. This ensures that even if an existing name may qualify for removal under the new removal criteria, there will still need to be community support for the name to be removed. The core naming committee will review the request based on merit, scored against the criteria of the policy. If the name review meets the criteria for removal, affected community groups and equity deserving groups will be notified and requested to form a renaming subcommittee. The subcommittee will be requested to recommend one of the following responses. Recommend to the core naming committee that the municipal asset be removed and renamed, or identify another action supported by the subcommittee. Renaming criteria is very simplified and may occur when a name removal application has been approved, or when a non-commemorative name on a municipal asset is to be replaced with a commemorative name or an Indigenous language name to honor an individual or local Indigenous community. So the renaming process was created to ensure that those who were most harmed by commemorative place names would receive priority for deciding how to rename and address this, and how to address this process. So how do we rename? The core naming committee shall engage with the community groups and equity deserving groups to request feedback on signage, plaques, and other interpretive materials that provide information to the public about the cultural and/or historical context of the name removal and renaming. If the affected community groups or equity deserving groups would prefer to have the residents of the municipal asset select a new name, the residents will be informed via letter mail or other means that a municipal naming process has been initiated and their feedback may be requested. Authority to rename a municipal asset for any reason outlined in the naming criteria of this policy is held by City Council. So this concludes our explanation of the draft naming policy. Minor edits are still being conducted by our team and the city's administration team. However, in essence, the draft we have shared with you today is the same draft that will be presented to council. To recap, we shared the draft revised criteria for naming, process for naming, criteria for name removal, process for name removal, criteria for renaming, and process for renaming. We'd like to remind you that the policy is in a draft state, and we are seeking a final round of feedback from the public. At this time, we invite you to take our new survey located on the Cultivate the Conversation webpage, and please stay tuned for further project updates on the Cultivate the Conversation webpage. Thank you for viewing, and thank you for your interest in the project.